Hello, my name is Katie Rose Borrello, and my presentation is entitled Environmental Horror, Edgar Huntley, the Eco-Gothic, and Fear of the Unknown. Edgar Huntley, or Memoirs of a Sleepwalker, is an early American novel written by Charles Brockden Brown in 1799. Brown is known by most critics as the grandfather of the American Gothic mode, a style of literature that was greatly defined by the themes from this novel. The novel is set just outside of Philadelphia in the year 1787. A short summary to ground us in the basics of Brown's novel. Edgar Huntley follows a sleepwalking man named Clitheroe through the woods of Pennsylvania, which sends Edgar Huntley on his own journey through the wilderness. Huntley himself sleepwalks through the forest and ends up in a dark cave. After he escapes the cave, he is only confronted by another obstacle of the wild, a panther, which he kills out of fear, then, ravaged by hunger and thirst, proceeds to eat the flesh and drink the blood of the panther. Throughout his journey out of the woods, Edgar confronts Native Americans, many of whom he kills to save both himself and a young girl he has rescued. He continues on a perilous journey through the picturesque yet terrifying environment of the Pennsylvania landscape and lives to tell the tale by writing a narrative letter to his fiancée, which comprises a majority of the novel. Themes from this novel include the state of the unconscious mind and the mystery of sleepwalking, and more pressing to my studies, the savage. This term Brown uses to describe the panther Edgar encounters and kills, the many Native Americans Edgar encounters and kills, and the untamed wilderness which Edgar encounters and which doesn't necessarily kill him, but certainly does change him. Essentially, through this latter theme of an untamed wilderness, Brown establishes a central fear of the early American settler's mind, the unknown. No longer is it the British pastoral and innocent countryside, it is now the unknown and unexplored wilderness of the new America and whatever unknown fears it contains. This is a critical fear of early America which shapes Brown's novel and which solidifies the idea that nature is something to be feared. This is why I believe that Edgar Huntley is more than just the birth of the American Gothic novel, but the birth of the Eco-Gothic, the birth of environmental horror, the birth of the genre of the eco-horror. Now, eco-horror is something that is mostly used to describe films which use the environment or products of the environment as terrifying monsters which inflict harm on innocent humanity. Think of the films listed here, plus the many more, which portray nature as the unstoppable, formidable, and fearsome unknown, which haunts the minds of audience members. Think even more to literature or classic horror stories in which the forest itself is an ominous figure. For example, in Lord of the Rings, there's the ever-present fear of the unknown and what comes after leaving the pastoral shire and having to venture into the wild of Middle-earth, where bad things end up very much happening. Now, my research certainly does not focus on movies, but I see this idea of eco-horror as a transportable idea, which is certainly present in literature and media, and which really originates with themes from Charles Brockden Brown's late 18th century novel. I would like to establish what we call eco-horror for film as the Eco-Gothic for literature. Now, you might ask yourself, what exactly is the Eco-Gothic? Since I have mentioned it quite a few times, I'll try to break it down here to its two primary theories, ecocriticism and the American Gothic mode. Firstly, ecocriticism. This is a newer criticism of literature for which many critics do not agree upon a singular definition. Is it the study of biology in literature, nature itself, surrounding environments? I personally like Lawrence Beall's simple interpretation. Ecocriticism is simply, quote, environmental criticism. I intend to use the simple relationship of literature to the environment as a basis of my research on defining the Eco-Gothic. Now, the second part of the Eco-Gothic is, quite obviously, the Gothic, specifically the American Gothic, which derives from its British roots in Romanticism. The Gothic is a style of literature that utilizes the text as a way to incite fear and anxiety in a reader. In the British mode, this was often done with stories with castles and secret passages, vampires and fellow monsters, foreboding relationships between royalty and damsels who were quite often in distress. Now, since America did not have large ominous castles and cathedrals as settings, the Gothic turned to the fear-inducing woods, picturesque landscapes, and whatever Charles Brockden Brown describes as, quote, the savage. that be wild animals, wild native people, and wild nature. For example, Edgar encounters rushing rivers that bring him to the point of death, plunging caverns that bring him to the point of death, falling trees, which you get the point. The following 3 quotes from the book greatly describe how Edgar sees the wild as savage. When he encounters the panther, he says, "To die by disease or by the hand of a fellow creature was propitious and lenient in comparison with being rent to pieces by the fangs of this savage." When he encounters Native Americans, he says, "Most men are haunted by this species of terror or antipathy. I never looked upon or called up the image of a savage without shuddering." And when he experiences the wild itself, he says, "Famine and blindness and death and savage enemies never fail to be conjured up by the silence and darkness of the night." Now, in her introduction to the American Gothic, Teresa Gadou states that there is more to Gothic literature than what Edgar uses here as dark imagery. I think that more is an eco-critical fear. I see this connection with eco-criticism to the American Gothic and the natural ways that early American authors who were writing in the Gothic style were trying to play on the fears of Americans at the time. Essentially, this fear of what the wilderness holds, for the countryside was largely unexplored to the everyday Pennsylvanian, and the fear of the unknown, what the wilderness contained and the untamed wild that it held, that was the ultimate fear which authors in the late 18th century really wanted to play on. The Eco-Gothic was just the natural mode which authors used. Authors like Brown began and solidified the fear which haunts us to this day, the fear of the unknown, specifically the unknown of nature and what it holds. Now, I'm using Edgar Huntley in my research to help define the Eco-Gothic, because it is certainly a text that utilizes nature to incite fear in the reader. Let's break down briefly the 3 fears that the reader, through Edgar's narrative, experiences. Firstly, the fear of the unconscious mind. This is what Edgar experiences when he is overcome by his passions and ravenous self while being in the woods. The unconscious and untamed violent self emerges when helped by the untamed wilderness. Secondly, the fear of the untamed wilderness itself. Edgar repeatedly is mistaken for other things when he is spotted in the wilderness. He is mistaken for a Native American, a ghost, a dead body, and is essentially just a completely unrecognizable person when he encounters civilization again after his gallivanting through the woods. The untamed wilderness alters his image, completely changes his appearance to his friends, and that is something that is truly terrifying. Edgar becomes like an animal, with little control over himself. The forest, untamed and unvisited, is something to be feared, and Edgar becomes it. And finally, most importantly, the fear of the unknown of the wild and how it infects Edgar to become an unrecognizable being. Thomas Cole, a 19th century American painter, famous for founding the Hudson River School, illustrates very nicely this fear. In a series of paintings entitled The Course of Empire, Cole paints various states of landscape. The one that you can see on top, the pastoral state, illustrates texts before the American discovery of the scary woods. This is an innocent and beautiful, picturesque landscape. The latter painting you can see, entitled The Savage State, reveals the idea that surrounds the Eco-Gothic. The untamed wilderness, the unknown of the forest, and the foreboding things that the forest contains, that is something to be feared. After surviving an encounter with the Native Americans, and before journeying deeper into the forest, Edgar fears what will become of him if he ventures even deeper into the unknown. Quote, "I might issue forth into a wilderness of which I had no knowledge, where I might wander till I perished with famine, or where my footsteps might be noted and pursued and overtaken by these implacable foes." The woods contain the unknown, and that is something to be feared. So the use of the environment as a horrific and terrifying tactic of inducing fear in a reader is certainly more present in literature than we think. The eco-horror style is more than just film. It begins with the early American Gothic literary period and continues with the development of the Eco-Gothic approach to literature. These are my works cited. Thank you so much.